Hello, AP English Language and Composition students. Welcome to Lesson 46. We are still critiquing arguments, and I'm going to teach you the proper format, also referring back to the previous argument about validity and soundness, but a proper format to follow when critiquing, writing a full essay critique. Right, so let's start to look at our argument. It's from Plato's Apology. Right? In ancient Greece, Plato was a student of Socrates, but Socrates didn't write things down. He was taught in the streets, and Plato wrote it, reconstructed arguments. Maybe they weren't exactly from Socrates, but the ideas came generally from Socrates. So, supposedly Socrates said all this, and Plato wrote it down in his Apology. But we're going to critique it, right? So, we need to understand it. Take a look at it. It's very much like Hamlet's, in Shakespeare's play Hamlet, tragedy, the to be or not to be soliloquy, the third soliloquy. It's very much like that, because you'll see why. Here we go. For death is to be as it were nothing, and to be deprived of all sensation. And if no sensation remains, then death is like a dreamless sleep. In this case, death will be a blessing. For, if anyone compares such a night as this, in which he so profoundly sleeps, as not even to see a dream, with the other nights and days of his life, and should declare how many he had passed better and more pleasantly than this night, I think that not only a private man, but even the great king himself would find so small a number that they might be easily counted. Can you follow that? Well, hopefully you generally you have the idea. In order to critique an argument, we have to find its main claim, which will be its conclusion. Can you figure it out? It does come pretty early on. Pretty early on. Well, he is making a claim here, but this is the more important one, okay? This is the main claim. It is the conclusion of what's like a syllogism, right? So we have, death is to be deprived of all sensation, or if death is to be deprived of all sensation, and if death is then like a dreamless sleep, then death will be a blessing. So it's more apparent than most arguments, the syllogism, it's in here, right? A form of a syllogism anyway, a logical progression and a conclusion. So our main statements, right? We have this, and this. So we found it. All the rest is more support, it's a little bit extraneous. So now we are in a position to start to critique. So what do you do first? Find the conclusion. Find the key premises. Then determine if they're sound and valid. So now let's move on to our next step. Well, I've already done that, so I'm going back to page 10. Okay. So, sometimes it takes a little bit of reconstructing to understand an argument. So this was one of supposedly Socrates' assumptions. Death is to be deprived of all sensation. If no sensation remains, death is like a dreamless sleep. Death is a blessing. What they've done here is add in more ideas that would have been small steps to get to this point right here. But we still want to look at the main premises and the conclusion. Is it true that death is to be deprived of all sensation? Who knows what death is like? Who's been there and who has come back? Supposedly some people have near-death experiences and come back, but generally not 100% sure about that. So we might have some questions about that premise. Is that what death is really like? For instance, Hamlet says that we can't know, not that he's an expert, but just for example, Hamlet says we can't know what happens in the afterlife, so we better not, commit suicide to go there. So he's saying can't be sure. Maybe it's torture or something. So anyway, this maybe we could find fault with, because who can tell? If no sensation remains, death is like a dreamless sleep. So he's saying death is like a dreamless sleep. First of all, can sleeps be dreamless? Even if you don't remember them, we still usually have dreams if you get to a certain level of REM sleep, right? And we don't even know what death is exactly like. So there's a lot of conjecture here, and it would be hard to be totally accepting of these statements. So we might say this argument is unsound. All right, do these ideas flow together? Yeah, they are. There is that logical flow, especially when you reconstruct the ideas that are unstated, that are really assumed. Okay. So, all right. Now, let us look at an evaluation, a critique that is already completed. All right, so let's look at that together. All right, so here it is. And this is what you are going to be answering some questions about. So I want to explain it a little more. And I have it broken up by section on how it's answered. Certain points shift, and there's different ideas in these different sections that I've marked off. So I have to make it a little more legible for you. Okay, there we go. Okay, so look at that with me. Hopefully you can see all of it. So, Socrates' argument that death is a blessing and the apology is interesting but suffers from some weaknesses. So I am actually giving you the answers for your worksheet. I just have to find my explanation on here. Okay. What is being identified here? What do you identify first? The conclusion. So when you're making your overall evaluation critique and writing it all out in an essay, identify the conclusion first and tell what you think about the argument as a whole. It's kind of general, all right? Interesting, but suffers from some weaknesses. Now, later in this full critique, you're going to see that these two words, interesting and weaknesses, you can't just throw words in there, that you're making a point. You have to support each one. What is interesting and why? What is weak and why? Don't just throw ideas out and not support them. But anyway, you do start with the conclusion and generally overall what you think about the argument, but your words matter. Okay? So, moving on. The second section is right here. And so, let's see, it goes, as it stands, it's not convincing. So this is the second part right here. So the person who wrote this is saying, why? So part two, this is a number 2 right here. Why the argument is weak, all right? Why? So they're answering this point first about the weakness. It's not convincing. You could say it's unsound or invalid or both, whatever, but not convincing. Now you've got to support that. So the third section is answering why it's weak in detail. Okay? He cannot establish what death really is, but only what people think about it. He never discusses what death is, only what people think about it. Therefore, he cannot reach his intended conclusion. So he's not identifying the terms, right? Moreover, the whole argument hinges on whether it's correct to say that the lack of sensation is like a dreamless sleep. That was the second premise, the minor premise. Sleeping seems to imply the possibility of waking, so it's quite different in this respect from a complete lack of sensation. Is it fair to say that a corpse or even a stone is doing something like sleeping just because they cannot sense anything? If we do not accept this assumed analogy, Socrates' argument does not follow. So there's a lot of discussion and detail related to real life, sort of fleshing out the ideas that he did not consider, that Socrates did not consider, that show the limitations on his points. But anyway, part 1, part 2, and this is part 3, specifics about the weakness. Part 4, this section is specifics about maybe some positive points about the argument, how it's interesting. Socrates does raise the interesting point that death might be compared to the rest of the days of one's life. In this case, it might be that death is better than some days, but worse than the very best days. If so, then death is perhaps not something to seek, but not something to fear either. Even if death is not a blessing, perhaps it is not a curse either. So, whether we totally agree or not with the argument, we still might get some value from it. It might prompt some thought and reevaluation of our ideas, even if we don't totally buy it, but we might get some different understanding about death, and that's what he's saying there. So there is some benefit. Right? So we don't want to be totally negative unless it really is totally weak with no merit. That's all we can be. But usually if you're being thoughtful, you can find some positive notes. So what is the last thing that you do? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? Finally, you summarize what you draw from the argument. Socrates' argument does lead us to reconsider our common view of death as something invariably bad and the worst of all possibilities. So a summary of what you draw from the argument. So you're not drawing much from the negative, but you are drawing something from the positive. So hopefully, I'm still under the time. Let's look.